Great, thank you. Thanks, Emily. So those are the people who will be presenting today. And I'm just going to give a quick brief update on Black Thrive. So next slide. Oh, back. Yeah. So where some of this all comes from, Emily's already talked about Black Thrive and the fact that we started in Lambeth and we're working currently in Birmingham and Haringey as well. How all of this kind of exploration started and why we've made why data is so important is that we asked ourselves, how come evidence-based policies and practices have not produced positive outcomes for Black people? And that then leads to the question of what is the evidence, and who decides what is valid, what information is collected, and how it's interpreted. And so with all of that in mind, our mission is to address the inequalities that negatively impact the mental health and well-being of Black people, placing Black communities at the forefront of reimagining, redefining, and co-creating a society in which they thrive. We have only two priorities, and they're a bit big. One is building a Black Research Institute and Observatory, of which Celestine is the lead, and Jolien and Tamanda work within that team, and embedding race equity in systems change. So with that, I will hand over to Celestine.
Awesome, thank you, Leila. Emily, why don't we skip this slide and go to the next one? So, okay, whenever I do these talks, I like to just kind of tell you at the beginning what the main point is, and this is the main point that I want to put across to you in the next sort of 15 minutes, which is the way in which you answer the question, what is race, will dictate all that you do and interpret from any data. And I want to kind of take you through an exploration of that. But to start, next slide, please. I'm gonna sort of kick you off in a very different place. So in order to explore this question, I want you to imagine that a close friend or a family member has invited you to go on a walk. I just sit with that for a second. What images come to mind? How are you dressed? Where might you be? Emily, next, click along. And so for me, this is what comes to mind. Maybe something similar came to mind for you. I would argue that if we were in a room full of people that live on your street, the same image would come to everyone's mind, whatever that might be. Next, Emily. But if I ask you, for example, the same question, a friend has asked you to go on a hike, what images then come to mind? What will you wear? How will you prepare, etc.? Next picture, Emily. And maybe it's something like this. Different environment, different kind of clothing, different kind of dress. But I would imagine that most people have come up with the same sorts of images, same sorts of ideas. What I'm trying to point out here is something about shared knowledge. And really, shared knowledge is quite fundamental to human existence. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we can think about this shared knowledge that's kind of always in the background. There's always some kind of shared knowledge, some common sense that's in the background, and that's really fundamental to human cooperation, both at the micro level and at the kind of macro level. So, for example, if this talk was happening in person, even if it was in a place that you had never been to, you could all imagine how the room would be laid out. You can think about where would be an appropriate place for you to sit, where would be an appropriate place for the speakers to sit, and you would have some intuitive sense of when it's appropriate to ask questions. But no one needs to tell you any of this. It's just there in the background. Obviously, this is fundamental to human survival. I've never put my finger into an electric plug, for example, but I know that it's a bad thing to do. And of course, this shared knowledge, which is not the same for everyone, right? There are different communities of shared knowledge, underpins culture, ritual, social exchange, etc. And we can think about, what happens when someone passes away. All of my Jamaican friends will know what a nine night is, but the rest of you might not. This is what common sense is. It's the knowledge in the background, the things that go without saying, the things that are taken for granted. What it also does is it creates some boundaries around what appropriate behavior is. As I mentioned, if this was in person, you would know when to speak and when not to speak. People speaking out of turn would be seen as very odd. But no one needs to give any rules about this. It's just kind of what we know. Okay, next slide, please. The other thing that common sense does is it provides for incomplete information. So it fills gaps in information. When we don't know everything, we fill the spaces that we don't know with the knowledge that we already have. I'm sure lots of you have come across this riddle before. There is a reason why for some people the answer to this is really difficult to get to. I'm going to read it and I'm going to tell you what the answer is, but you can think about it for yourselves. If you've never seen this before, then it will be interesting for you. If you have seen it before, then of course you know what the answer is. So a father and son have a car accident and both are badly hurt. They're both taken to separate hospitals. When the boy is taken in for an operation, the surgeon says, "I can't do this surgery because this is my son." How is this possible? Okay, if you don't know what the answer is immediately, it's because of your common sense knowledge about what doctors can be. And doctors are often men. The answer is that the doctor is the mother. Okay, so lots of people take a long time to come up with this, but it's because of this taken for granted background knowledge about what is normal, what is usual. And it is true in some sense that usually, unfortunately, surgeons are men. Okay, what has any of this got to do with race? I'm going to get there. So next slide, please. So in the case of race and racism, the answer to the question, what is race? Okay, is completely fundamental. And there are different ways of answering this question, which often go unexplored, unsaid. We don't worry about this question often. We usually worry about things that come down the line, if you like. So I'm going to explore some of the possible answers to the question of what is race through the context of unemployment. So next slide, please. Okay, so here's some unemployment data that Jolion's run for us. Essentially, for people who work with quantitative data a lot, this is basically raw data, okay? So this is the employment rate of Black people and white people in Lambeth, which, as you've heard, is an area that we work in, is where Black Thrive kind of came from. And what this data shows is that the difference between the employment rate for Black people and white people is about 20 points different. And over 6 years, there's been basically no change. There's been kind of weird things going on at different times where the employment rate is closer and further away, but overall, the trajectory is a 20-point gap with no change over 6 years. So that's the data that I want you to hold in mind as I take you through these brief examples. Next slide, please. Okay, so one way of answering the question of what is race is to say that race is biology. Okay, so Black people and white people have some different kind of biology, different genetics. We're different fundamentally in our essences. Okay, so if that's the case, what is the reason for the low employment rate of Black people? Well, it's meritocracy, of course, because Black people and white people are not the same. Black people are not as good, not as capable intellectually as white people are, and therefore meritocracy means that there is this gap. So what should we do if this is the case? Well, we might say we'll promote the type of careers that Black folk are capable of. We might promote specific routes into employment for Black folks. For example, apprenticeships. This is not to badmouth apprenticeships or say that they're bad, but there's obviously a tiered system here. So you don't say you should go to university and get a degree in economics or whatever. You say you should do an apprenticeship. And what is the evidence to support this intervention? Well, it's the data that you just saw. It's the 20-point gap between Black people and white people. Okay, next slide, please. Another way of looking at this is to say that race is culture. Okay, so Black people behave differently. They have a different kind of cultural norms. They behave differently. They're maybe aggressive, they're bombastic, they're lazy, whatever it might be. Okay, and you would say that the reason for low unemployment is that the behavioral patterns of Black people, the way they behave, the way they act, make them less employable. So then what do? You create some kind of like behavior change intervention. Okay, soft skills, how to talk to people, psychocompulsion, you know, you have to be happy, you have to smile, etc. This is maybe a route to intervene on this matter, given this way of looking at it. And the evidence that would support that intervention is the same raw labour market data that you just saw. There's a 20-point gap between Black people and white people in employment. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then we might say, there's a different way of looking at this as well, which is that you say that race is not real. Race is a social construct. Race is just our agreement that these categories exist. That's what race is. Race is just that we agree that there's something called Black people, something called white people, and that's what it is. And in that case, the reason for this difference in unemployment can't be biological, because there's no such thing as race. It also can't be cultural, because again, there's no such thing as race. The reason for this low unemployment is our belief that some races are superior to other races. This is another way of looking at this question. And so what you might do then is you develop some anti-racist frameworks, whatever that might mean, some different policies, some different practices. You might hold organizations and individuals to account for racial diversity. You might engage in positive action, which the Equality Act provides for. And again, the evidence to support this intervention is the same raw labour market data that you've seen already, 20-point gap between Black and white people. Next slide, please. There's another way which doesn't fit the same sort of trend, which is race is a kind of, we don't care what race is. Race is just a box ticking exercise. We need to do something. So it doesn't matter what the answer to the question of what is racist. It's not pertinent to tick in the box. So the reason for low unemployment, again, is not really relevant. All that's relevant is that we are seen to do something about race. In which case, you would create a strategy, maybe, or put together an expert working group, or do some comms about what activities you're doing in relation to this. In this case, and this is the odd case, but it's a prevalent case, the evidence is not relevant. All that is relevant is that you are seen to do something about race. I don't want to say, personally, what you think race is. But you also know how it's seen in your organization on the basis of what you do with the information that you have. And I think my call to action, if you like, is to consider the fundamental question of what race is as the starting point before the collection of any data, because it will affect the interpretation of whatever data you get. I don't say that one of these is right or wrong. Different people will have different views and opinion, but I know that one of these ways takes us somewhere, and a lot of the other ways won't take us anywhere. I'm going to hand over to Jolien now, who will talk more specifically about how you deal with the actual data that you have in hand. So I'm starting here at a kind of more philosophical, theoretical place, but Jolien will talk to us about some actual practical action. Good, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Alison. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. Yeah, I'm Jodian, and yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about my experience sort of developing, so my having sort of worked at Black Thrive now for 6 months. I'm going to talk to you a bit about my experience as a white person doing research in the field of racial justice, and things that I've learned in this period that I didn't necessarily think about so much before. Next slide, please. So I've used this scene from The Matrix as kind of an analogy of what my experience is. Experience has been. So fundamentally, I kind of liken it to an awakening to a reality that I didn't know was there. So I assume many of you are already familiar with this, but essentially in this scene, the protagonist is making a decision between taking a red or a blue pill. If he takes the blue pill, then he stays in the matrix, which is a simulated reality, which he knows and is comfortable with. Or if he takes the red pill, he exits the matrix, enters the real world, which is a lot less comfortable, a lot more challenging and unknown. And this, it was kind of my experience when I started working at Black Thrive, was this basically having a veil pulled back and realizing that there's a whole other element to data and research and the world, indeed the world just generally, you know, so I speak as an individual as well, that is fundamentally different from the world that I thought I knew. Next slide, please. There's a few things I'll talk about today. So the first two things are kind of more on a practical level and relate to sort of data and research and how I think about them in a different way now. So these are racialization and homogenization of groups of people, and the notion of white as a default position. So white as like a baseline position, and then measuring other groups of people as a deviation from that baseline. And then I'll finish up by sort of just talking a little bit about my experience of learning about race as a social construct, which Cedison has already talked about. Next slide, please. So the first big eye-opener for me, having started working at Black Thrive, was coming around to this idea that that the majority groups, so the white groups of people, or white people, aren't racialized in the same way that minority groups are. So often we don't think of a white person as having race, but we do think of non-white people having race. And hand in hand with that comes a tendency to homogenize. So this is the tendency to characterize all members of a group as fundamentally similar. And this is relevant for research because it means that researchers, including myself, tend to assume that there's variation to explain within a white population because we assume that it's normal, it's not racialized, and it's often the population of interest in some research. So we assume that there's variation to explain within that population, but very little variation to explain within minority populations. An example of this is the term, or could be seen in the term BAME, where, as I'm sure you're aware, it stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic. But having started work, this is a term that I consumed regularly. It was, you know, it's used in research, it's used in media, and I've typically in the past would just accept that term as, you know, as it is, as referring to something meaningful. But it's worth asking the question: what does this mean? Does it make sense? Is it useful? And so, as I say, in the past, that way of reasoning seemed quite normal. I'm now more aware or more wary of accepting the utility of that. So, as I said, we know there's huge variation in populations within the same demographic. So does it really make sense to create a whole category of people that span very different demographics? So these are the sorts of questions that I started to unpick working at Black Thrive. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, just one more thing, if we can go back again. So as an example of this, so this kind of like asymmetry in the way that we see and treat racialized groups has an impact. So I'll take an example from my doctoral research, which was to do with social decision making and inequality. But my approach was very experimental, and often my participants were university undergraduate students. So that already meant that from a design perspective, my research was focused on a predominantly white population, which meant implicitly that my study was designed for a white population. But because I hadn't thought about white people in racial terms at that point, that created this situation of unknowingly creating and running an experiment and interpreting an experiment which was on a white population, even if I wanted to say something about everyone. Next slide, please. So related to this point was another thing that was quite eye-opening for me, which again, which you might find surprising as a researcher, sort of not having thought about it before or encountered it often before, but it's this notion of white as a baseline against which we measure how other racialized groups deviate. So what this does is creates a sense that whiteness is a normal status, and that variation from that normal status needs to be explained. And I've mentioned how that can be seen in the design of experiments, but what I want to focus on here is in terms of interpretation of the findings that we get from data. Next slide, please. So what I mean when I'm talking about white as the baseline is that what we need to ask ourselves, like, what are we trying to explain? So are we trying to explain, for example, are black people different to white people, or are white people different to black people? And I have a couple of points from work that we've done a few months ago that kind of illustrates this idea. So next slide, please. So here we have a part of our shared measurement system, which is a set of indicators that measures the disparities in experiences between the black and white population in various areas. So this one is for Birmingham, and I use this as a way of illustrating the way that framing this question in terms of what is our baseline and what's our comparison, I use this to illustrate how the way that we frame that question may differ depending on the context. So drawing your attention to this stop and search statistic, this 2.63. So this is the rate at which the black population and the white population differ in terms of how often they're stopped and searched by police in Birmingham. And we've interpreted, I presented it in this way. So if you look at the graph on the x-axis, you'll see that it straight away that it's the likelihood of the outcome compared to the white ethnicity. So straight off the bat, we're comparing outcomes for the black population to the white population. Now, the way of interpreting this is by saying that black people are over two times more likely to be stopped by police than white people in this period. And that's from a white baseline frame. The inverse of that would be to say, if we took the black as a baseline, we would be saying that white people are over 50% less likely to be stopped by police. Now, actually, in this situation, I think that it is appropriate and useful to frame this in terms with a white baseline, so that we're sort of because in this way we're really sort of highlighting the fact that there's a higher rate of stops of black people, which is presumably a result of over policing. However, could I have the next slide, please? In this example, so this is the same set of statistics, and again we're still using. Originally, we did still use white as the baseline against which to compare. But again, it's an example of how I'm still kind of going through this process of working with what was the most appropriate and effective ways of working with these statistics. So this statistic, we have a a relative risk ratio of below 1, which basically means that the likelihood is less for the Black population compared to the white population. And for this statistic is about relates to the rate at which 16-year-olds achieve at least a level 4 in maths and English at GCSE. Now, the white baseline way of talking about this, of expressing this, would be that Black children are 10% less likely than white children to achieve level 4 GCSE maths and English. But when you frame it in this way, there's a possibility of giving the impression that there's an achievement gap, or like that Black children are underperforming. If you reverse it and use Black children as the baseline in this situation, you'd be saying that white children are 10% more likely than Black children to achieve level 4 maths and English. And that kind of tells a different picture. So what the question that we're asking there then is, why are white children achieving level 4 GCSE maths and English at a higher rate than Black children if they're supposed to be having the same education? Now, obviously, these statistics aren't, we can't ultimately find the ultimate cause just from these statistics alone. But what I wanted to illustrate by talking about this is the fact that the way that we use a baseline and think about how we're comparing groups of individuals has an effect on the kinds of questions that we ask and the answers that we can get from them. Next slide, please. So just to finish off on this default and deviant, there's another element of this that I've started to sort of become more acquainted with, which is the use of language when we're talking about a white, non-white distinction. And I just wanted to mention this because in certain contexts, and not all the time, so I think I should have given the caveat before that, you know, none of what I'm saying is prescriptive, and obviously there's a lot of things that may change with context, but there's a risk of portraying things over simply by having a white, non-white binary, to the extent that we end up representing groups or giving the impression that groups are not normal, which is what this false dichotomy of white and non-white can sometimes give. Next slide, please. So finally, I just wanted to sort of talk. So another big revelation that I've had is coming to terms with this question of what is race, as Celestin's already put to us. So is race an objective truth, or is it a subjective social reality? And I'm learning that this is a really important question, as Celestin's already highlighted, for data and analyses relevant to race. So in this, if we take an example of trying to understand health disparities, we analyze some data and we compare by race, and we find that, for example, Black people tend to have worse health outcomes than white people. Often that's where an analysis can end. So we find this difference, we end an analysis, and we read about it in the newspaper, and that's where things end. But what I've learned is that there's a whole nother distinct set of questions behind that that need to be explored. So what I'm coming to realize is that relationship between race and, for example, health disparities is at best descriptive, and what ideally needs to happen is to go beyond that, to understand what is the ultimate cause, and in this way you start to see race as an effect as well as a cause of the racial justice issues that we have in society. Next slide, please. So just as a kind of summary of the things that, you know, I think are probably takeaways from what I've talked about. So as I just mentioned, I've learned that what I'm trying to do is move more towards a mentality where you're getting to the ultimate causes. So you're going beyond race as an explanation and trying to understand the why as well as the how. And this involves challenging persistent normative ways of thinking about race, So whether that's like homogenizing groups and really considering whether it's appropriate, when and if it's appropriate, as well as challenging these kind of well-established practices of using majority groups as baselines. So more generally, I found that just proceeding with like an awareness of these things and sort of improving my awareness of the intricacies of racial justice research is very helpful, you know, both for the research we're doing, but also just in terms of understanding conceptually at a conceptual level what it is we're doing when we're talking about race. And I think that's all I have. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That was amazing, all three of you. So thanks to Layla, Celestin, and Jolyon for that. Very eye-opening, very thought-provoking set of pieces. What we're going to do now is we've got a little bit of time for a Q&A. If we can do this in two ways. First of all, if you've got some things that you'd like to sort of post in the chat, which we can take questions from the chat. You're also very welcome to raise your hand and ask a question to the group if you unmute yourself. Whilst you're sort of thinking, the other thing we'd just like to know about is if you are very unfortunately not able to stay or don't want to join the breakouts that are going to follow this session, if you could also post the fact you're not coming along in the chat. We won't sort of organise you into a breakout room, which is kind of what we're doing at the moment behind the scenes. So if you can let us know that. So any sort of, just looking at the chat, is there any sort of burning questions that come from it? There's a question from Michael. Michael, do you want to ask this one verbally, or I can read it out for you, but you're much more articulate than I am in most things.
Well, I don't think that's true. And I mean, it was just a reflection as Jolyon was talking. It reminded me of James Baldwin's work, asking, you know, why did we create these constructs? And it's a question primarily for the white population. And I suppose in the context of Black Thrive, you know, what function does this play for systems? Why have we created this division? What's the purpose of it? But the only thing I just observe listening to the presentation, it's a struggle, isn't it, on the shared measurement system, that in a way we're trapped by these constructs that, you know, you still have to have a line somewhere. And, you know, on the measurement system, the line is comparing Black people to white people still. We've got to find a way out of this trap.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen asks, any engagement with the NHS around this? Any sort of they don't collect their own data. Use things about premature mortality for people with a learning disability. They stop with race as the cause of disparities within this population. Is that anybody from colleagues from Black Thrive? I don't know whether with mental health, I'm guessing that you touch data in the NHS and have some experience of, or some perhaps some reflections on that. I invite anyone to sort of respond to that.
I can kick off and other people can chip in. So I think that as is alluded to by Michael and Joe and others, is that, you know, there is a kind of working with what there is. And so if you're somebody working on the ground, doing your day job, a lot of the things that will come at you by way of data and evidence will be imbued with assumptions and biases. And so nothing you might not be able to do much about that. I mean, we could try, and we do try to influence the system to think about these things generally. So I think when it comes down to working on the ground and in places, the question is, what are the questions that you ask yourselves? how do you go about answering those questions? Who do you do that with? So those are some of the thoughts I would have in terms of the NHS, you know, and will continue to do what it does for probably some time to come. And we have the same data often as you will have. So the questions are, what lies beneath, and how do you go about understanding what it really means at a local place level between communities? And then the point we were making earlier from Black Thrive's point of view is who's on that journey. So even for us as Black Thrive, we absolutely do not know or understand everything. There are lots of sub-communities of the Black population that we don't fully understand, and therefore we have to engage with a broad spectrum of Black people in order to understand them. So on issues of disability, sexual orientation, and those sorts of things, we have to educate ourselves about the intersections that we may not as individuals be familiar with. I'd invite other colleagues from Black Thrive, anybody, to respond, or indeed anybody in the audience, actually. So I can see you smiling, Tamanda. Did you want to say something? I knew you'd want to say something.
You know, I have no poker face, Layla. Well, I mean, just to say that really one of the fascinating and unique positions that we're in now, unfortunately, in the wake of yet another Black death and the murder of George Floyd, is that we have investment to have established the research institute and observatory that Celestine is now leading. And one of the pluses, I'm new to the team, I'm only 2 months in, but we've got quantitative and qualitative experience within our team, and we're a young new team that need more support. But as I was listening to your reflections, Jolyon, on the categories and the binaries that we're talking about, I am kind of reminded that this has been quite a long-standing conversation within anti-racist movements. And then Michael's further point about Baldwin and this question of who benefits from having these constructions. I think one of the concerning, there's a real power to having data, but one of the concerning aspects of the way that whiteness, white systems and white supremacy can function is that it can start to put the burden of saying that the very categories that were created through colonial systems are, you know, you're reinforcing them and you're reproducing the racism, and you're responsible for the problem of saying that you're using static Black white categories, when in fact what you're doing is drawing attention to the category of race and the way it does really shape Black lives. So personally, I feel that having that binary, while we know it is somewhat false, is really important for drawing attention to disparities. And yes, there is work to be done to unpick different aspects of the Black experience and the diversity that exists within it, and all other communities, because everyone is racialized in one way or another. But it is important to be able to show that disparity as starkly as you've laid it out, and to be able to say what Celestine said, which is that I think it was Black men are 20% less likely to be employed in Lambeth over the last 6 years data, apart from a few wobbles, and in Birmingham that people are 2.6 times more likely to be stopped by police, because the risk is that we get into systems data conversations where we sit there and go, well, is this really Black, and does this really count, and does this, and then you don't actually address what the data is telling you. So that's the first thing that off the top of my head I'm thinking about, because this is a long-standing debate about racialization for someone who's in sociology like myself.
Fascinating, thank you. I mean, I wonder, sort of listening to you, sorry,
Joey, I just wanted to chime in on that point, but maybe after.
No, go for it, John, of course.
Yeah, no, just like from a quantitative perspective as well. So part of our ambition as well is to really get to the roots of going back to this question about how do we start exploring like the beneath or beyond the categories of race. And it is difficult, and I think it's a difficult question, an uncomfortable question for society generally, because it kind of, in my opinion at least, it kind of it implicates or it highlights some big issues with our society. So it's going to be a difficult transition. But what we can do, or what we hope to do, is if you, in a quantitative sense, control for everything that you think is relevant, and you still find that there are disparities, then it paints a clearer picture of that it's racism and not just race that's going on. So there are, just to say that there are possibilities for getting to that from a quantitative perspective. The challenge is data accessibility, like you say, and data quality, which is a whole other conversation, but related.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of draw that out, because there's a few questions around some of the practicalities of this, is what can people, or what have you, perhaps in Black Thrive Festival, what have you done differently, or how have you what's changed in the way that you've approached data as a result of this experience, and in your case, Joe, this kind of matrix moment of really understanding that the reality is quite different. Can you kind of bring it alive for us a bit in terms of what you've been able to do that's different, or what you think others perhaps, and perhaps there's others out there that might want to share their own experiences too, or what you've seen that might be helpful for people to understand?
Sure, yeah, so one example would be to do with the groups that we use to, or how we aggregate data. So instead, for example, because I don't want to say that there is never a situation where it's going to be interesting to compare the white population to a non-white population and use that binary. But what I'm saying is that what we need to do is start working away from a mentality of thinking in that way. So in our work, we aim to disaggregate as much as possible, because if you disaggregate as much as possible, you can always aggregate back up. So you can always do a white non-white comparison, even if you disaggregate all the way down to as far as you can go. So that's like an example of where you can start trying to be more specific with the groups that you're using. But then maybe, if you do need to do certain comparisons, you can still do those. So it's about starting the journey at the beginning and thinking about how you want to collect data clearly, with an intention of what the analysis is going to be. So yeah, that's one example of what we've done. Another one that is extremely relevant for this conversation, which we are currently working on, is actually the product of Yasmin's mind, is we call it a data pyramid. It's kind of looking a bit like a tree at the moment, but this is basically a set of steps that we're trying to put together on how effective an organization can be in terms of the way it collects data, and the way it analyzes that data. And that includes stuff like disaggregating, like collecting data with an intention to do this analysis and this analysis, all the way up to things like having an analysis plan before you start, making your data and your methods transparent and available. So that's something we're working on. But yeah, just wanted to put that out there as well, actually.
Great. I'll bring you in later in a sec, just to remind people, if you want to chip in, please just use the raise hand function, and I'll notice that you want to speak. So Layla, over to you.
Hi, yeah, I was just going to say that we've had quite some arguments internally, so that's also something that is worth saying. That so we're not all agreed any more than all white people would be agreed, or white people and Jolien are one white fellow. But we're not all agreed, and some of this is just an exploration of and going back and forth with some arguments. So as an example, looking at education, for example, noting that in London on the whole, I think over London as a whole, but certainly for a number of London boroughs, the African young people are one of the highest achieving group, and the Caribbean young people are the lowest achieving group in a number of local authorities. So the question and the arguments that we have internally is, what does that mean? But it's almost like, for me, you have to kind of know that. If you merge them together, you'll probably end up with. And so the information that Jolien presented was a merged version of Black people. If you separate them out, you've got very, very different outcomes. And for me, it's something that I am very, very curious about. I don't know the answer to, but the idea that you separate them out, you see that there's this huge difference, and then you ask yourself why. So this is back to race is not race as a social construct. So what has gone on for these different populations? And you find that this is the case for Africans who are 3 generations in, for example. So we're not talking about new arrivals and so on. So it's not easily explained. And there are lots of other bits of qualitative information that might begin to help us think about the understanding. But you have to be quite forensic in thinking about the experiences that different communities have had, how they have ended up in the UK, what their parents came here to do when they came, and so on and so forth. There are lots of things that you could ask. I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure that there's some attempts here and there to understand this, but for me, that's an example of where the disaggregation is important, and that you have to for me, I think you have to embark upon the exploration with humility and honesty, and not fall into race trap like the Tony Sewell report of saying, well, actually, this is the case, therefore there is no systemic racism. But in my view, you need a kind of open and honest and humble exploration to begin to get underneath and to involve communities as well.
Thank you. I mean, for me, actually, that kind of exploration is the key word, that it could, because we don't necessarily have the data to find out what's the cause of those disparities, because we don't collect it in many cases, and we don't really know what we're going to find. So I think one thing I've also admired about Black Thrive's work is that much broader way of bringing intelligence in to inform that kind of journey. It's not just about the quant, important that is. It's about other things as well. Anybody want to? We're going to breakouts in a second, but just really to ask for any reflections in plenary from anyone else on this call around their journey on this, things that they might want to share. You're going to breakouts and have an opportunity to do that, and we'll have some reflections very shortly afterwards, but just anything that people want to sort of chip in. Raina, I think you've put your hand up.
Yes, it was just a quick question about, I think, something that's just been referred to about the data not being collected. I'm just wondering what sort of work are you aware of trying to collect new data, perhaps from a lot of the data that's currently being collected would be probably from government departments and so forth, which leaves out a whole host of other data and actually questions that could be asked. I'm just wondering, since we know this to be true, going forward, are there any thoughts about how this data can start being collected or what we should do about that?
Anyone want to weigh in on that one?
Maybe I can say something this time around. Yeah, thanks for that, Raina. That's a important point. I think there are a couple of things. So, like, the first is to still think a little bit about the quality and quantity of administrative data. So, there are lots of people. We know there are lots of people here from lots of different kinds of organizations, public sector, private sector, etc. And people in this room will know whether you even have any data whatsoever. And in a lot of places, the answer to that question is no. So there are a range of areas where nothing is collected and should be. And in fact, the public sector equality duty suggests that it's your legal requirement to do so. And still, it's not there. That's not a kind of critique of people who know their teams are not doing it, but it's like you need to get going on this in terms of collecting that kind of administrative data, just about outcomes, who's receiving services, etc. A lot of that's not there, and when it is there, it's not publicly available. So that's a problem, and we're trying to work on that. one of the things that we were working on recently is stop and search data, which is kind of like semi-publicly available, but making that kind of more accessible. So Joey in particular has been working on, you know, what is essentially the largest stop and search data set in the country. All stop and searches over the last 4 years or so. So like, you know, millions of stop and searches. That is available, but it needs to be processed. And it's kind of like who does the processing. So there's that kind of thing. But then there is, you know, what you're directly talking about, which is that, but there are things that we might be interested in that have nothing to do with what public systems want to collect. And I think this is a problem. We have a plan. We probably need some money to fulfill the plan, but we have a plan to start addressing that, which is recognizing that even in the most robust academic work, which has you know, completely stratified samples, which are supposed to be reflective of the national population, the total number of Black people in those surveys is often less than the number of Black people that we would have in our Black Thrive Lambeth surveys. We're talking in the kind of low hundreds here. What if we could have, you know, a database of people who have signed up to take part in meaningful research and who, you know, have their contact details there to be contacted about surveys or about interview work and so on. I think this is something that can easily be addressed with kind of not that much money and just a few organizations who are willing. Black Thrive being one, of course. And I mean organizations who are on the ground working with Black people day to day, not just kind of like random organizations. But yeah, I think it's something to be solved. Not yet solved, but not difficult to solve either. I hope that somewhat answers your question.
There's a call to action. Anyone wants to join in? We'll take one last question before we go into breakout rooms. Gwen, I think you got your hand up if you want to come in.
Yes, hi. I was just trying to hold two ideas in my head, and I guess a question around, you know, I speak as an educator who's worked a lot in the US as well as here in the UK, and the idea sometimes that something that resonated from the early conversations is that often these racial differences around performance and attainment can feel slightly deterministic, and so I guess without making light of, I guess, historical inequities, where the opportunities, I guess, to take an asset-based lens and lead with the strengths and aspirations of a community in, I guess, really approaching data and research, because and challenging, I guess, dominant narratives about, I guess, those disparities.
Don't know whether the Black Thrive team want to comment on that.
I want to nominate Layla.
Fair enough.
I don't know. I'm nominating you back, Celestine, or Tamanda. Spoken a lot. Come on. Come on, Celestine.
Okay. The reason why I didn't immediately put my hand up for this question is because it's hard. Those disparities are real. And an approach which says, and I'm not suggesting that this is your view, but an approach which says that we should kind of ignore those and basically just kind of say how good everything could be or is or can be at some point feels divorced from reality. Nevertheless, what my kind of research and my academic background is all about what I kind of talked about, which is kind of common sense. And when we say, here are these disparities between white and Black people, we are building the common sense. So of course, now you go into the classroom as an educator and you say, well, clearly the Black kids are not going to be as good as the white kids because we know all of this information about all these disparities. So it's really tricky. I don't know what the answer is. I think that, but having said that, there are examples of schools in the UK which mostly have Black children in them who have a higher rate of entry to Oxford and Cambridge than some of the very expensive private schools. So there is something about saying, about kind of like talking about the positive stories that are out there, and the positive work that's been done, and to show that yes, people, if you give people the right environment, have the right ambition for them, their outcomes can be the same as anyone else's outcomes, of course, because there's no such thing as race. So, you know, there's nothing that's fundamentally different about Black children, which means that they can't achieve. And so the questions then become, what can we do as schools, as educators, and so on, to enable that, notwithstanding issues of the wider social context.
If I just chip in with a quickie, which is around for me personally, quite a constant dilemma, which is, we know the system is problematic and essentially racist. But what I would say is, there's something about, do you promote and focus on Black exceptionalism? Do you focus on, actually, one option could be to say, actually, and in addition to changing the system, not instead of, what can you think about that would change the reality for people? Because it's a two-way thing. If people feel empowered, then the chances are that they will overthrow the system. So sometimes I do wonder myself whether it is the empowerment of the people that could lead. So I've worked at the DFE for a brief time, and what shocked me was the absence of pressure. There was no pressure on them to do anything about Black kids, or indeed poor children, or much else really, but there's no pressure. So I'll leave it at that, because I know we've got to move into breakouts and so on.
Thanks, everyone. That was a really good debate. So what we're going to do now is, as Leah said, we're going to move into breakout rooms. What I would say, we're not going to record the room, so this is an open and safe space, because this is a really difficult subject in many ways to talk about. But it's we encourage you to be open and to air your kind of your experiences and views in those spaces. And then we'll come back briefly at the end for a bit of sharing and talk about a bit about what next. Emily, I think you're going to do the honours.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and thank you all. I'm just going to put in the chat function just a couple questions to start the conversation. One is, what kind of stood out for me from what I heard from this discussion today? Secondly, what implications might there be for my own work and interests? And just sharing that in a safe space, I think, can be quite helpful. And I think we're going to have 5 groups in total, and each of them will be facilitated with one of the Black Thrive team members. And we've got about 15 minutes. And when we get back, it'd be just great to hear from several of you on what stood out from the conversation. So see you back in 15 minutes, and really hope you enjoy the discussion. Groups, really, what some of the kind of points were that you'd like to share with the broader group. Just want to make that open to everybody.
I might start, if that's okay, for our group's point, partly because Carleen was in mid-flow very eloquently, and then we got thrown out of our breakout group. And we had a really interesting discussion on the last point, which I'll just finish for Carleen. She can contribute if she wants, is, you know, we start with a change of mentality as well as the data. And I expect, Celeste didn't get a chance to reply, and I expect they're interchangeable a little bit, would be my guess, but because evidence informs, you know, the way you think, as well as the way you think informs how you use and think about data. And so I think that's probably the answer without putting anyone's mouth. And then we also talked about the need to bring infrastructure together to give you that visibility of data that allows you to then the system, and so it's getting systems change. And we discussed briefly whether that was more feasible at a place or a national level, but we needed that kind of join up and visibility. So, and then Celeste gave some great examples of where data doesn't exist around. There's no data on life expectancy. Who knew? We don't know, particularly around racial groups. You don't know how life expectancy in Black people. So how the hell are you going to deal with health inequalities? I don't know. And then data being not available at a level that you can interrogate what it means for racial justice. That data is too summarized. And that's that doesn't help actually those and some. So those were the main points I got from my group. Anybody else want to contribute? Please do.
Thanks, Joe. And any other groups that'd like to add some of your thoughts?
I don't mind summarising our group, I'll try. So Andy and I both from Foundations, we just kicked off chatting a little bit about, I suppose, Foundations' roles in helping collect and fill some of these gaps in data, but doing it in a way that's supportive and that isn't onerous. And Leland mentioned, the role that Foundations might play in commissioning sort of research and data in that arena. We also, talked about how some of this stuff has been really practical. So some of the really practical ways of just framing research that can be taken forward really promptly in teams and in our organisations. And Edward mentioned how useful it was the way that Celestine framed the different ways of sort of unpicking race, or the different approaches to that, and race as a social construct, and is that being something that maybe that is part of that common sense, particularly in the third sector. We all think that we're really lovely lefties and that we all know how to do all of this already, but actually no, that was a really helpful way of framing it as well. So I think that was about everything. But I think all of us agree that it's been a really interesting and enlightening session. So thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I'm going to, just on the back of that, actually invite everyone just to put in the chat group, because it'd be nice to sort of read other people's thoughts, just maybe one idea or takeaway or sort of insight that you would be taking away from this session. If you could share that on the chat, that would be really helpful. But the other question that Joe and I particularly had for you is, what other topics would be of interest to you to cover in webinars like this, either around racial justice or around the broader theme of place-based work? So if you could maybe share some of those thoughts there. Meanwhile, I'm going to do my little plug and send you all info@placematters.co.uk if you'd like to join our network and receive our newsletters and updates. That's the email that you can use.
The other thing to say while you're thinking about those points, doing them, is that we had in mind that this might be the first of a series of conversations around this subject. So if people would be interested in carrying on the learning journey with Black Thrive and others, then we'd be interested to know whether you would be interested. So if you could drop that in the chat or email us, that would be really good, and we can think about whether there's an appetite for that.
Great, thank you for those contributions. Brilliant, thanks, Celestine. Super. I think the other thing, just to share before we end today's session, is to say, I think, Leila, you brought this comment out when we were talking about the idea for this session, which is really, this is about mutual and co-learning. It's not about sort of, and I think all of our forums have to be about mutual peer-to-peer learning. So hopefully there's been learning in all directions. That was very stimulating from my perspective, and I hope it was stimulating for everyone here. But I wanted to sort of say a huge thank you to the Black Thrive team for spending all that time thinking about it, planning it, and just sharing your thoughts and facilitating the sessions as well. So really appreciate that. And thank you to all the participants and for all your comments and questions and discussions. And we hope to see you at a future event very soon. Thanks, everyone.